All right, moving along to story number 2, where we are going to leave America temporarily and we are going to jump across the Atlantic Ocean to France, the land of Gay Paris, although apparently now you can no longer say Gay Paris because gay can no longer mean happy. Gay can no longer mean happy as well as someone who prefers to sleep with someone of the same sex. It can only mean the latter now because if you try to make it mean the former, which is actually its original definition, you're somehow an oppressor. It's another sign of oppression, which, are a dime a dozen these days. But anyway, Gay Paris has now become Bloody Paris because within the last couple of years, France has suffered several major terrorist attacks, which have been Islamic in nature. We always found out that the perpetrators of these terrorist attacks were Muslims, as a matter of fact. So, for example, there was the Bataclan concert hall attack, there was the Charlie Hebdo attack, a church in Nice was attacked, a teacher near Paris was decapitated, 3 people in a church in Nice were stabbed to death, and there's been a whole horde of churches that have been set on fire in France, which the French government, from my understanding, has been kind of mealy-mouthed about their origins, how exactly these fires got started. But many people, again, from my understanding, have come to the conclusion that they are arsons, in fact. And there have been multiple cases, too, of statues being decapitated. So statues of the Virgin Mary, statues of Christ, statues of different saints, like St. Joan of Arc or St. Denis, who were French, right? They've all been decapitated or attacked. Now, many people have claimed that one of the big reasons for this is that in a situation similar to here in the United States, France basically just allowed in a whole host of people. They allowed a whole host of people to immigrate to France, whether they were interested in actually becoming French or not. So, as the commentator par excellence, the one and only Mark Stein, the most unwoke bloke in Bespoke. Yes, I am plugging Mark Stein and his podcast, which you can find by going to Stein Online, which I've linked to in the description box below. What Stein has pointed out is that there are now several neighborhoods, several suburbs in France that the police no longer even go to. The Metropolitan Parisian police no longer actually go to these suburbs and maintain law and order because Islamic law, Sharia, is actually the law of the day. So if you're a tourist or if you're, a Frenchman who somehow commits an offense, it might go badly for you. In France, too, there are schools now where the actual faculty at the schools have told Jewish families that their kids can no longer go to these schools because they can no longer assure their safety, or because it just creates too much conflict, because having Jewish kids and Muslim kids side by side, because Muslims they can have a problem with Jewish people. And so at first, Stein was talking about it actually just in his last Q&A session, where he took questions from around the world from people who are all part of the Mark Stein Club. The schools at first told these little Jewish kids, pretend like you're not Jewish when you're here at home. Now think about that. In a day and age where if you're gay, you're lesbian, you're trans, you're bi, you're ecosexual, you're whatever, telling that person to just pretend not to be that thing, well, that is not only a violation, a severe violation of human rights. It's not only practically a crime against humanity, but it is an actual metaphysical attack against the core of that person himself. And yet here, at the same time, these schools were telling little Jewish kids, hey, pretend like you're not Jewish here in school. Pretend like you're not part of the chosen people. So that's an interesting contrast in and of itself. And then when even that was untenable, then they just were telling the family, hey, your kids can't go to school here anymore. Basically, you Jewish kids are going to have to go to school somewhere else. That has been the state of France for the past couple of years. Now, in answer to all this, about 1,000 members, this is actually from the BBC, about 1,000 servicemen and women, including some 20 retired generals, put their names to a letter. It blamed fanatic partisans for creating divisions between communities and said Islamists were taking over whole parts of the nation's territory. This is again from the BBC. What did the letter say? It warns French President Emmanuel Macron, his government, and MPs of several deadly dangers threatening France, including Islamism and the hordes of the banlieues, the impoverished immigrant suburbs that surround French cities. The signatories go on to blame a certain anti-racism for splitting up communities and seeking to create racial war by attacking statues and other aspects of French history. They also accuse the government of seeking to use the police as proxy agents and scapegoats by brutally repressing the popular gilets jaunes or yellow vests protests of recent years. It is no longer the time to procrastinate, otherwise tomorrow's civil war will put an end to this growing chaos and deaths for which you will be responsible, with numbers in the thousands, the letter concludes. In a country which pays for several thousand former generals on the retired and reserves list, the support of just 20 of them to such explosive language does call for a sense of perspective, the BBC's Hugh Schofield in Paris says. Nevertheless, that the letter was written at all is a sign of dangerous times, and the backing of Marine Le Pen, who is a populist leader in France, means the themes will continue to resonate in the year of campaigning that lies ahead, our correspondent says. Interestingly enough, the French soldiers who warned of civil war will actually face sanctions because it is, in France, against the law for any serviceman active or in the reserves to talk about any issue that is political or religious. It's, if I am remembering the very little of the French history that I actually intook during college, this was part of the Grand Compromise. I believe in the time of the Third Republic, after the fall of the Second Empire with Napoleon III, who was the nephew of the first and glorious Napoleon, where they said that church and state were going to be absolutely separate. So, you had the civil society, you had the religious society, because they wanted to, it was an attempt, a liberal sort of modernist attempt to try to prevent what happened during the French Revolution from happening again, where a lot of priests and religious were actually executed because the church and the government, the Ancien regime, had in many aspects intertwined to such an extent, and both of them at the highest echelons were very corrupt. So that's the law in France. Again, I believe it was the Third Republic. It might have been earlier, so don't hold me to that, gang. French history, not my forte. But anyway, so these French soldiers, the soldiers who signed an open letter saying France was in peril from Islamism and the hordes from the suburbs, are actually now going to be sanctioned. This is from the DW website called dw.com. A group of 18 serving soldiers who endorsed a warning about the risk of civil war in France will face sanctions before a military council, the chief of staff of France's armed forces said on Wednesday. The group, which included 4 officers, signed an open letter in a right-wing magazine, which was also endorsed by at least 20 retired generals. Each one will go before a senior military council. General François Lecontre told Le Parisien, a local newspaper. Lecontre said that they could be delisted or put into immediate retirement. Meanwhile, France's Prime Minister Jean Castex said that the rare intervention in politics by military figures was violating France's republican principles and the honor and duty of the army. Lecointre emphasized on the obligation of neutrality among the members of the military, unquote. Now, the reason why I am bringing up this story, not only because it is a big deal, gang. This has not happened for a number of years, and it shows just how precarious French society and Western societies all across the globe are in at this moment. We are being tugged in multiple different directions. We have sort of the old school post-World War II world order enthusiasts who continue to say that, this dominating global liberal world order is going to just solve everything. Just give it a little bit more time. We have to buttress it. It will work. Then we have the woke who are just attacking anything that belongs to Western civilization because they believe Western civilization, whether they're Americans, whether they're British, whether they're Canadians, whether they're French, whether they're Germans, whether they're Belgians, what have you, they believe that Western civilization is evil and therefore must be destroyed so that they can recreate the world in their own image. And then you have people, a growing number of people, who might be called traditionalists, or you might call them actually realists, who have said we can't go with the woke, but the post-World War II order, everything that it was promised that it would do, none of it has happened. So we have to think outside of the box. This is where you get populism. This is where you get the resurgence of a patriotism. Some people have called it nationalism. I mean, this explains, for the umpteenth time, how Donald Trump won election in 2016. This also explains how Brexit happened in 2015, I believe. The two events that just left the liberal world order in a tizzy. They couldn't explain how it happened. So this is where we are. All these forces are pulling at us, and now everything is getting frayed. The fabric of society is getting frayed. And now these generals and the servicemen in France were absolutely correct that it is reaching a tipping point. You cannot simply ignore it. You cannot simply have tough talk. I mean, President Macron was saying, there was a story from just last week, it was published on the 23rd of April. He said that France will never bow down to terrorists or to Islamists. And yet, as we've seen, the terrorist attacks keep coming. Some stabbings over here, a detonation over here, a church burned over here. Oh, here, a teacher decapitated actually over here. Decapitated! 21st century France. A man is actually decapitated. Like we're in the Middle East, or we're back in the Dark Ages of the 9th or the 10th centuries. So obviously the talk isn't working, which is exactly what these generals pointed out. But they also grasped onto something even more elementary, I believe. What these servicemen and women and what these generals understand, which is something that so many of our elites on the left and the right, and I know those are worn out terms and categories, but what they have forgotten, what they have chosen to forget, is that a country has to be more than simply a geographic location on the map. There have to be strong forces that actually hold a society together. There has to be a dominating culture. There has to be a mainstream dominating culture that is for that country, right? A culture for the French, a culture for the Germans, a culture for the Brits, a culture for the Indians in India, a culture for the Hungarians, a culture for the Kenyans, a culture for the Nigerians, a culture for the Ugandans, a culture for the Mexicans, etc. Everywhere where a particular people has congregated, they need their own culture, they need their own language, they need their own traditions, they need their own manners. They need all these things. They also need a religion. They need an animating theological force to also hold them together. Because as Russell Kirk pointed out, Where we get our word culture comes from cult, which now has a negative connotation. It means a bunch of brainwashed Scientologists or, pseudo-fascist, neo-Nazi, Fourth Reich panting, KKK robe-wearing nutcases. When actually the word culture actually comes from cult, which originally meant simply the local religious tradition of the area, the local god, the cultus, which was actually the nucleus of a local society for age upon age upon age. These generals understand that. They understand that this is what people need. This is what a country actually needs in order to remain a country. France needs the French language. It needs French culture. It needs French history. It needs French heroes. It needs, if you actually want to get technical about it, Christianity, specifically Catholicism, since that is what was the dominant religious force in the country from the 7th, 8th century AD until the 19th century. And even in the 19th century, when there was that sharp divide between church and state, the dominant religious sentiment in France was Catholic. There's a reason why, by the by, France is called the eldest daughter of the church, i.e. the Catholic Church. If you change those forces, if you try to neutralize them by saying, well, we need a neutral public sphere, or we need to honor all holidays. Not everyone celebrates, for example, Le Fête Nationale, Bastille Day, July 14th, because some people, aren't originally from France, so we have to honor, Indian holidays or Islamic holidays or, German holidays, etc., etc. If you start to change that, the French language is just as equal to all these other languages that everyone happens to be speaking who are living within the borders of France. When you start to change that, you change the very warp and meaning of the country itself. Because when you start treating your country as just a bunch of real estate, nothing more than an empty house on a lot that anyone can move in, then pretty soon you're not even going to have the house anymore. You might think, that you're the boss because you were there first or you're the landlord, but pretty soon the whole thing is going to fall apart because there's no social glue holding it together. That's what these servicemen and that's what these generals understand. And that's why they are so dangerous, because it is, in a sense, a pre-modern understanding of people, culture, societies, and nations. And again, it is foreign. So there's always a little fear in what is foreign, but also it means that the global liberal order, what many people have made their millions on, made their fame on, if that goes, if that has to go to preserve actual nation states, it means that they're out of a job. They no longer have a platform to preach, to gain their fame, to have their platform, to have their adoring audiences. And that's why this open letter has frightened so many people, not only in France, but I would also say outside of France. It is well worth knowing that it is happening and well worth keeping an eye on, gang. That is story number 2.